Hey everyone, my name is Austyn and I'm going to be one of your unit coordinators. So today I'm going to take y'all on a little bit of a hike. We're going to look at some cool trees and also some cool other things that you can find in the forest. As I'm walking through forest behind my house, I don't have to worry a whole lot about going off of trail because there are no trails. But if you decide to go on hikes in a park, you want to make sure that you're staying close to the trails so that you're not disturbing any animals, and also so there aren't any animals that might be hiding somewhere. In the winter it can be hard to identify trees because a lot of them don't have their leaves, but one tree that's usually pretty easy to find is a beech tree because they keep their leaves. When they're this color, they're pretty cool because they lose all of their chlorophyll in the fall and turn this nice color brown. That is sort of what the leaf would look like without all that chlorophyll that absorbs the sunlight. Why do you think these trees keep their leaves instead of dropping them? This is a fern, and ferns are kind of growing all up over this little slope here. That's what all that green stuff is. And there is one really close up here. So ferns are really cool plants because they typically don't use flowers to reproduce like other plants do. Instead, they'll either grow by tracing their roots underneath the soil, or they use something called a spore. Spores aren't quite seeds, but they are what a fern needs to reproduce to another place where there wasn't previously a plant there. They're also really cool because they have these really twisted up little shoots that come from the ground, and slowly they'll start to unfurl, and eventually when these little shoots grow up they start to look like these big long fronds like right here. You can also notice that these leaves look a little bit like mini ferns themselves. And that would be something called pinnate leaves. These ones are neat because they have little thumbs. I don't know what type of fern that would be, but I can go home later and try and figure out what ferns have little thumbs. Another way that you can learn about forest ecosystems is to look inside of the dead and rotting logs. Animals and bugs that eat dead matter are called detritivores. They have a really important role in the forest ecosystem. Even though this tree is dead, it's still providing a lot of nourishment to this forest. But right now, a lot of the nutrients inside of this log aren't things that other plants and animals can use. That's where the detritivores come in. They can eat this stuff that wouldn't provide a lot of nutrition to you or me, or even other plants. And when they eat it, they can pee and they can poop it out. By doing that, they make it available to plants that use it in the soil. Also, by eating things and growing a little bit bigger, they themselves become food for birds and larger animals that need a little bit more protein in their diet. If you look really carefully at logs like this one, you can start to see signs that animals have lived here and possibly still live here. There's lots of little holes that are probably put there by beetles that start to eat the rotting wood of this log. You can also start to see tunnels that were dug by different animals, like right there and there. I even found a little fly that was living inside of that log. Each of those different roles that the animals and plants play is called a niche. And a niche is a special job specific to every organism in the forest that none of the other organisms quite have that's the same. Right here I found a tree that's pretty interesting, and I don't know what type of tree it is, but we can use this as an opportunity to practice our observation skills so that when I go inside I can try to look up more information on the internet. So these trees, if you count the number of leaves that are growing, There's 5 leaves on each little cluster from the branch. You can also observe how the leaves are growing. Sometimes leaves all grow like one leaf at a time from a branch, but this has all of the leaf shoots coming out from one spot there in the middle. So it might not look like there's a lot of living things here in this little part of the forest, but if you look a little bit more closely, you can see that there's a lot going on here. A lot of different types of organisms have taken root and started to grow. So the first one is this type of moss that's kind of covering this rock. Moss is really cool because it's really soft to the touch, and it's also one of those organisms that's usually second or third when it comes to living on spaces that nothing lived before. Another organism growing on this rock is this right here. This is a type of lichen, which is a really interesting organism. In fact, it's not one organism, but it's 2 living together and helping each other out in what's called a symbiotic relationship. This one is a mutualistic relationship, which means that it's good for both of the organisms that are a part of it. This lichen is made up of fungus and of algae. Those organisms work together. The fungus helps provide structure for the algae, and the algae helps provide food for the fungus. And the lichens are especially cool because whenever there's a surface that has no soil and no nutrients, lichens are some of the first ones to live there. And for that reason, they're called a pioneer species. You can usually identify lichen by finding patches on rocks that are a little bit off color, like this one is. And there's not really an edge there, it's smooth, but this is definitely a living organism, whereas the other surfaces of the rock aren't as much. In the same little corner, there's also fungus growing on this fallen branch. Funguses are really neat for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. As I keep walking through the woods, I want to keep practicing my skills of observation. Even though I can't see leaves, I can start to look at the bark and just see what I notice. So I found this tree, which has some really cool bark. If I look up at the top, I can tell that it's not alive anymore, but I can still learn some things by looking at it. The first thing that I noticed is that it's got this really unique and grooved bark. So there are lots of different trees that have bark that looks like this, but this definitely shows us that it's something unique. You can also look at the part of the tree that's been stripped away, and you can see the tunnels and the holes that have been put there by organisms using this tree as a home. Beside the other tree, I found this tree, which also has some interesting bark. One thing I noticed is that all its branches are way up high. I've also noticed that it's got flaky bark. One last thing that I can notice about this tree is that it is 2 trees coming out of the same trunk. This is what we call codependent. Eventually it won't be able to support this side and that side with its one root system. This side of the tree will eventually die because it gets choked off by this tree trying to take its nutrients. Once this tree dies, though, it leaves a big open wound right there, and this tree might get some type of disease from its open wound. In front of me in this tree, you might notice a different type of bark from the other ones we've looked at. This one has a really smooth bark. If you look right here, you also might notice that it has little shoots coming out of its branches. This is what's called a leaf bud. And this type of tree has really pointy and sharp ones. It doesn't have many of its leaves left on it, but this is a beech tree, just like the first one we looked at. I finally made it to those evergreen trees up at the top of the hill. And one thing I've noticed about them is that they have really flaky looking bark. It's not flaky like those thin strips we saw before. Instead, it's these big, broad pieces of bark. If I look way up at the top, I can see that all its branches, the leaves, stay near the top, and there aren't as many down here. My guess is that's so it can get lots of sunlight up at the top. You can try to figure out what type of pine it is by looking at the needles. Underneath this tree, I found a lot of little needle clumps that look like this. So you can count them and see that there's 2 needles, and they're a little bit twisted around one another. This is pretty good evidence that this tree and the other ones around it, over here and there, are what's called Virginia pines. Alright, so as I keep walking around in the woods, I also noticed this really cool rock with a bunch of other rocks stuck to it, almost like they're growing from it. I don't think that's the case, but I am really curious about how this rock got to look the way it is. Maybe it's an old slab of concrete and other things have weathered away. And one last thing, because I am an outdoor professional, I hope that y'all have fun on your own adventures, and I'm excited to meet y'all this summer. Bye! This video would not be complete without me showing you one last kind of tree and telling you how to identify it. So, that right there is a beech tree, and you can tell it's a beech tree because of the way that it is. Isn't that neat?